Hi, welcome back. I didn't exactly finish chapter 1, so I'm going to start where I left off at more about trauma in chapter 1. I believe it's almost over. But I'll just probably go straight on to chapter 2. More about trauma. Trauma occurs when attack or abandonment triggers a fight-flight response so intensely that the person cannot turn it off once the threat is over. He becomes stuck in an adrenalized state. His sympathetic nervous system is locked on, and he cannot toggle into the relaxation function of the parasympathetic nervous system. One common instance of this occurs when a child is attacked and hurt by a bully after school. He may remain in hypervigilant, fearful state until someone takes action to ensure that he will not be re-victimized. And until someone helps him release the hyperactivation in his nervous system, if the child has learned through experience that he can come to at least one of his parents when he is hurting, frightened, or needing help, he will tell mom or dad about it. With them, he will grieve the temporary death of his sense of safety in the world by verbally ventilating, crying, and angering about it. Moreover, his parents will report the bully and take steps to assure that this will not happen again, and the child will typically be released from the trauma. He will naturally relax back into the safety of the parasympathetic nervous system's functioning. Simple. One-incident traumas can often be resolved relatively easily if CPTSD is not already present. If, however, the bullying happens on numerous occasions and the child does not seek help, or if the child lives in an environment so dangerous that the parent is powerless to ensure a modicum of safety, it may take more than parental comforting to release the trauma. If the trauma is not too continuous over too long a time, a short course of therapy may be all that is needed to resolve the trauma. Provided, of course, the dangers in the environment can effectively be remediated. When the trauma, however, is repetitive and ongoing, and no help is available, the child may become frozen in trauma that the symptoms of simple PTSD begin to set in. This can also occur during the prolonged trauma of combat and entrapment in a cult or domestic violence situation. If, however, a person is also afflicted by ongoing family abuse or profound emotional abandonment, the trauma will manifest as a particularly severe emotional flashback because he already has CPTSD. This is particularly true when his parent is also a bully. The 4 F's: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Earlier I mentioned that the fight-flight response, that is an innate automatic response to danger in all human beings. A more complete and accurate description of the instinct is the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. The complex nervous system writing of this response allows a person in danger to react in 4 different ways. A fight response is triggered when a person suddenly responds aggressively to something threatening. A flight response is triggered when a person responds to a perceived threat by fleeing or symbolically by launching into hyperactivity. A freeze response is triggered when a person, realizing resistance is futile, gives up, numbs out into disassociation, and/or collapses as if accepting the inevitability of being hurt. A fawn response is triggered when a person responds to a threat by trying to be pleasing or helpful in order to appease or forestall an attacker. This 4-fold response potential will heretofore be referred to as the 4 F's. Traumatized children often over-gravitate to one of these response patterns to survive. And as time passes, these 4 modes become elaborated into entrenched defensive structures that are similar to narcissistic fight, obsessive-compulsive flight, dissociative freeze, or codependent fawn defenses. Narcissistic is the fight response. Obsessive-compulsive obsessive-compulsive is the flight response, dissociative is the freeze response, and codependence is the fawn defense. These structures help children survive their horrific childhoods, but leave them very limited and narrow in how they respond to life. Even worse, they remain locked in these patterns in adulthood when they no longer need to rely so heavily on one primary response pattern. It is important to understand that the variances in the childhood abuse neglect patterns, birth order, and genetic predispositions result in people polarizing to their particular 4F type. In the next section, we will explore examples of how children are driven into these defenses by traumatizing parents. The 4 children in the vignette below match the 4 basic types of trauma survivors. Bob is fight, the narcissistic. Carol is flight, the obsessive-compulsive. Maud is the freeze, dissociative. And Sean is the fawn, codependent. The 4 F's in a CPTSD-inducing family. Carol was the scapegoat in her family. Narcissistic and borderline parents typically choose at least one child to be designated family scapegoat. Scapegoating is the process by which a bully offloads or externalizes his pain, stress, and frustration by attacking a less powerful person. Typically, scapegoating brings the bully some momentary relief. It does not, however, effectively metabolize or release his pain, and scapegoating soon resumes as the bully's internal discomfort resurfaces. Wilhelm Reich, in his brilliant book The Psychology of Fascism, explains how scapegoating occurs on a continuum that stretches from the persecution of the targeted child by a bullying parent to the horrific scapegoating of the Jews by the Nazis. In especially dysfunctional families like Carol's, the scapegoating parent often organizes the rest of the family to also gang up on the scapegoat. Carol discovered a great deal about her family childhood from watching home videos. Her parents were so narcissistically oblivious that they unabashedly recorded many incidents of Carol being verbally and emotionally abused by them. This was usually in the background of recordings of the performances of their favorite child, her older brother. Severely narcissistic parents are rarely embarrassed by their aggressive behavior. They feel entitled to punish a child for anything that displeases them, no matter how unreasonable it might appear to an impartial observer. Carol's parents started in on her early by disdainfully blaming her for soiling her diaper before she was even 1. By the time she was 3, she had been so frequently punished for making noise while talking and playfully exploring her house that her constant state of fear generated an ADHD-like condition in her. Carol's large backyard was her refuge where she would play with great gusto, climbing, running, cavorting, and building and ransacking villages that she made with her toys and leaves, grass, sticks, and stones. She would busy herself from breakfast until supper, often forgetting to come in for lunch, which she thought in retrospect made life even easier for her mother, who never called her in to eat. One family video from this time was the straw that broke the camel's back of Carol's denial that her family was abusive. It showed her playing a game whereby she would repetitively smack herself hard on the hand and call herself a bad girl as she wobbled around the living room, touching various knickknacks. There was a considerable amount of footage that showed her parents and siblings roaring with mocking delight in the background. When contempt replaces the milk of human kindness at an early age, the child feels humiliated and overwhelmed. Too helpless to protest or even understand the unfairness of being abused, the child eventually becomes convinced that she is defective and fatally flawed. Frequently, she comes to believe that she deserves her parents' persecution. When Carol was 4, she accidentally fell out of a second-story window. A few years later, she stepped out into the street in front of a car and was knocked to the ground. As an adult, she was convinced that both injuries contributed to her extremely painful early onset scoliosis. She also believed that she was in so much pain that she was unconsciously trying to end her life. Fortunately for Carol, school eventually offered a glimmer of reprieve. A kindly third-grade teacher perceived her intelligence and praised her enough that she soon became an excellent student. Unfortunately, the terrible anxiety that she lived with 24/7 soon morphed into an obsessive-compulsive approach to schoolwork. This, in turn, later manifested into a life-spoiling perfectionism and workaholism. Carol's older brother, Bob, the favorite and hero of her parents, was not molded with fear and rejection like Carol. Bob, the recipient of the parents' narcissistic expectations, was shaped into a multi-dimensional achiever by their withdrawal of approval for less than perfect performances. He was then given tidbits of praise for outstanding accomplishments that would reflect positively on his parents. He was also enlisted to further scapegoat Carol, and as time went on, outdid his parents in tormenting her. I believe there is an epidemic of sibling abuse that afflicts many dysfunctional families. Siblings in such families can traumatize the victim scapegoat as severely as the parents. In families with check-out, disinterested parents, they can in fact be the chief source of trauma. This is especially true in our culture where emotional neglect of children is rampant, and where parents are routinely advised to let the children work it out themselves. But how does a child who has half the strength of his older sibling work it out, and stop him from tormenting her without the aid of a strong ally? Bob himself did not scapegoat the pathological influence of his parents. Scapegoating became a habit for him, and he developed the narcissist's sixth sense for identifying others whose families had victimized and used them as targets. Bob, hurting from his parents using him and holding him to perfectionist standards, grew up to become a full-fledged narcissist and control freak. He aggressively tried to mold his loved ones as he had been molded, and was working on whipping his fourth wife into shape at the time of Carol's therapy. Let us return to Carol. As an adolescent, her trauma was painfully reinforced by her surrounding community, who so admired her brother's accomplishments that they joined the family in pathologizing Carol as a bad seed. Unfortunately, things deteriorated further for Carol as an adult. Even though she had seemingly escaped from the family, Carol remained symbolically enthralled to the family by getting ensnared with narcissistic people who are just as abusive and neglectful as her parents. This well-known psychological phenomenon is called repetition compulsion or reenactment, and trauma survivors are extremely susceptible to it. We will explore this extensively throughout the book. A third child, Maud, was born 2 years after Carol. By this time, her parents were worn out from incessantly molding Bob and Carol. Having whipped Bob and Carol into hero and scapegoat shape, they had little use for Maud. They did not have enough energy to interest left to whip her into anything. Maud became the classic lost child, and was left on her own to raise herself. She soon discovered food and daydreaming as her sole source of comfort. However, because Bob also enjoyed using her for target practice, she stayed in her room as much as possible. In retrospect, Carol also thought that Bob was molesting Maud. She hypothesized that these two factors contributed to the fact that Maud could not tolerate the various nurseries and preschools in which her mother tried to dump her. Over time, Maud numbed out into a low-grade dissociative depression and felt extremely anxious and avoidant whenever she was in social situations. At 4, an eccentric aunt gave Maud a television for her room, and she was soon entranced. She was forced to develop an attachment disorder in which she bonded with TV rather than with a human being. Sadly, she is still lost in that relationship, living on disability in an apartment cluttered with an enormous amount of useless, hoarded material. Poor parenting creates pathological sibling rivalry. Like many children in CPTSD endangered families, Maud could not turn to her siblings for comfort because her parents unconsciously practiced the divide and conquer principle. Her parents molded and encouraged sarcasm and constant fault-finding among the children. Moreover, interactions of cooperation or warmth were routinely ridiculed. Sibling rivalry is further reinforced in dysfunctional families by the fact that all the children are subsisting on minimal nutrients and are therefore without resources to give to each other. Moreover, competition for the little their parents have to give creates even fiercer rivalries. 2 years later, Sean was born. At first, it seemed as if he was destined for the same lost, dissociated destiny as Maud. But as he matured, he fell into the role of gifted child, as described by Alice Miller in The Drama of the Gifted Child. Sean's inborn gift coming into this life was his compassion and his sense that if he studied his mother enough and figured out what she needed, he could provide her for her needs. This would sometimes calm her down and make her less dangerous, bitter, and sarcastic. Over the years, Sean honed this skill and could almost clairvoyantly anticipate her sore spots, moods, and preferences. Sometimes it seemed he knew what she needed before she did, and with practice he became adept at diffusing her anger and sometimes even gaining morsels of her approval. Synchronistically, his mother realized she was getting old and that her alcohol-ravaged husband would likely precede her. Not wanting to be alone, she exploited his compassionate nature and primed him for domestic service for as long as she would need it. Sean remained living at home until his mother's death released him from emotional captivity at the age of 29. A friend of Sean's who knew all the siblings as adults marveled that it seemed as if each had different parents. Finally, it is also important to note that the scapegoat role does not fall exclusively on the flight type as it did with Carol. It can be bestowed on any one of the 4 F-types, depending on the given family. The scapegoat role can also shift over time from one person to another, and each parent or sibling may choose a different scapegoat. Whoo! That was an intense ending. Thanks for listening. We're all getting through this together. Separately.